I gave up on love not because I couldn't find it, but because I finally understood it. You might be living the exact life I'm warning you about. 3 relationships, 3 lessons.
Margaret and Collins was 19 years old in 1973, living in a small town in Georgia where everybody knew everybody and nothing moved fast except gossip. She was full of hope back then. Raised on Motown love songs spinning on her mama's record player every Sunday morning. And her mama had one piece of advice she gave more than any other. She'd look Margaret dead in the eyes and say, "A woman isn't complete without a man." She said it like scripture. And Margaret believed her. Why wouldn't she? That was her mama. So when she met James Walker at a church social that spring, Margaret thought God himself had answered her prayers. James was 5 years older. Handsome. The kind of handsome that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. He had this voice, low, steady, like a man who'd never been unsure of anything in his life. And when he chose her out of every girl in that church hall, Margaret felt like she'd been picked by the sun itself. Everybody told her how lucky she was. The neighbors. The church women. And her mother practically had the wedding planned before Margaret got home that night. That's how perfect it looked from the outside. The early days were beautiful. James made her feel seen, chosen, like the only woman on the planet worth looking at. He'd show up with wildflowers and say, "These reminded me of you, can't help but stand out wherever they are." And Margaret would melt. Every single time. She was 1 semester away from finishing her teaching degree when James told her she didn't need it. He said, "Baby, I can provide for both of us. You don't need to worry about all that." Her friends pulled her aside and begged her to finish. But Margaret chose James. Because she thought love meant sacrifice. She thought the bigger the sacrifice, the deeper the love. So she dropped out. And slowly, so slowly she didn't even feel it happening, she started to disappear. It didn't start with yelling. It never does. It started with little comments. James would look at her outfit and say, "You're wearing that." He'd hear her on the phone and say, "Why do you need to call her again? You just talked yesterday." She'd share a thought at dinner and he'd laugh and say, "You don't really believe that, do you?" Like her mind was cute. Like her thoughts were a hobby she'd outgrow. Small things. Tiny cuts. And piece by piece, the parts of Margaret that made her Margaret started falling away. She stopped laughing loudly because James said it was too much. She used to have this laugh that could fill a room. Gone. She stopped sharing opinions at dinner because it was never worth the argument. She stopped calling her friends because she was embarrassed. She didn't even know what she'd say to them anymore. Then one night she walked past the bathroom mirror and stopped. She looked at the woman staring back at her and did not recognize her. The eyes were the same but the light behind them was gone. That wasn't Margaret anymore. That was James's girl. And James's girl wasn't allowed to be too smart, too loud, or too much. She was just allowed to be his. That was the entire job description. It took her 2 years to leave. 2 years. Because leaving someone you've built your identity around feels like stepping off a cliff with no ground in sight. But she did it. She packed one suitcase on a Tuesday morning and walked out that door. And at 24 years old, Margaret went back to school and finished her degree. 1 semester. That's all she'd had left. 1 semester that almost cost her everything. If love is making you smaller, it isn't love. It's a cage with a pet name. Real love doesn't ask you to erase yourself. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink so someone else can feel big. The first person you owe love to is the person in that mirror. And how many people watching this right now need to hear that? Since your relationship started, have you stopped doing the things you love? Have you stopped calling the people who matter? Have you looked in the mirror and felt like a stranger was looking back? Because that's not love. That's disappearing. If this is hitting close to home, subscribe now, because the second man, the one who looked perfect on paper, that lesson cut even deeper. And you don't want to miss it. By the time Margaret turned 30, she was a different woman. She'd gone back to school, earned her teaching degree, and built a life she was proud of. She had a classroom full of kids who adored her, a small apartment she paid for with her own money, and a daughter named Clara from a brief relationship in her mid-20s. She was independent, confident, standing on her own 2 feet for the first time in her life. And she had made herself one promise: she would never, ever lose herself in a man again. And she kept that promise. But she made a different mistake entirely. Robert Collins was a good man. Not good on the surface with something ugly hiding underneath. Genuinely, all the way through, no asterisks, good. He was steady. Reliable. The kind of man who said he'd be there at 7 and was knocking on your door at 6:55. He brought Margaret flowers, not to impress her, just because he passed them on the way and thought of her. And from the very first day he met Clara, he loved that little girl like she was his own. He never hesitated. Never flinched. He just showed up and kept showing up. They got married. And it was a good marriage. Not a passionate one. Not the kind that sets your soul on fire and keeps you up at night. It was the kind that keeps the lights on. The kind where you always know what's for dinner and the bills are always paid and nobody raises their voice. Safe. Predictable. Comfortable. And for a woman who had nearly been erased by her first love, comfortable felt like heaven. At least for a while. But here's the truth Margaret carried silently for 15 years. She never loved Robert the way he loved her. She loved what he represented. Safety. Stability. Proof that she had made it, that she had chosen better this time. She didn't choose Robert because he was right for her. She chose him because he was the opposite of James. He was a correction. Not a genuine choice. And there is a world of difference between the two. Robert knew. He never said it out loud, not for 15 years, but he knew. Margaret could see it in the small moments. The way he'd reach for her hand while they were watching television and she'd let him hold it but never squeeze back. The way he'd say "I love you" before bed every single night and she'd say "I love you too," with that tiny little word "too" doing all the heavy lifting. He was pouring his whole heart into a woman who was giving him just enough to keep things running. And he felt it. Every single day, he felt it. Then one evening, 15 years into their marriage, Robert sat Margaret down at the kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee between them, both going cold. And he said something she has never forgotten. He looked at her with the saddest calm she'd ever seen on a man's face and said, "Margaret, I'd rather be alone than be someone's safe choice. And you deserve to stop settling too." They divorced. Quietly. Kindly. No screaming, no lawyers fighting over silverware. Just 2 people who finally admitted out loud what they'd both known in silence for over a decade. 3 years later, Robert remarried, a woman named Denise who looked at him the way Margaret never could. The way he always deserved to be looked at. Margaret went to that wedding. She sat in the back pew and watched Robert's face when Denise walked down the aisle. And she cried. Not out of jealousy. She cried out of guilt, because she'd had that man's heart for 15 years and never fully held it. And she cried out of relief, because he'd finally found someone who would. Don't marry the person who looks right. Marry the person who feels right. And if you can't tell the difference between the two, you're not ready for either. Some of you watching this right now are in Robert's position. You're loving someone who is never going to fully love you back. And you know it. You feel it in the hand that never squeezes back, in the two that follows every "I love you." But you're staying anyway because half love feels better than no love. And some of you are in Margaret's position, settling for safe because you're terrified of being alone. Both of those are a kind of cruelty. One to the other person. One to yourself. I need you to sit with that for a moment. If that hit you, drop a comment right now. Tell me which side you've been on, Robert's or Margaret's. Because I think most of us have been on both. Now if you think that's the lesson that made Margaret give up on love, you're wrong. There was a third man. The one who almost brought her back to life. And what happened with him is the part of the story nobody sees coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Margaret was 58. Both kids grown. Retired from teaching. She volunteered at a literacy center, kept a small garden, and read on her porch every evening. She wasn't looking for anyone. She'd finally stopped treating her own company like a waiting room for something better. Then Edward Malone found her anyway. 62. Widower. Retired carpenter. They met at a hardware store. She was buying soil, he was buying wood for a birdhouse. He made her laugh in the fertilizer aisle. Not a polite laugh. The real one. The big loud one she'd buried since James. Their first conversation lasted 45 minutes. Falling in love at 58 was nothing like 19 or 30. No desperation. No performance. Just two whole people choosing each other because they wanted to, not because they needed to. Edward didn't try to change her. He just showed up. Coffee every morning with too much sugar the way she liked it. Bad jokes at dinner. A quiet hand on her back when she was sad and didn't want to explain why. He never asked her to explain. He just stayed. Those were the best 2 years of Margaret's life. For the first time she was loved without conditions and loving back without fear. Then Edward got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosed in April. Gone by September. She held his hand in a hospital room on a Tuesday morning. He said, "Thank you for the best 2 years." And then he was gone. The grief wasn't a collapse. It was quiet emptiness. The chair at breakfast still pushed in where he left it. The half-finished birdhouse in the yard. Her phone not ringing at 7 anymore because Edward used to call every morning just to say, "Good morning, beautiful." Now most of you think Edward is the reason Margaret gave up on love. That it hurt too much so she never tried again. But you're wrong. Edward isn't the reason she gave up. He's the reason she almost didn't. So if he didn't break her, what did? If you're not subscribed yet, do it now because what she realized next changes everything. And have you ever lost someone who finally made love make sense? Tell me about them in the comments. Some people deserve to be remembered out loud. After Edward died, Margaret grieved deeply. Months of that quiet emptiness. But eventually she came out on the other side. And when she did, she realized something that changed everything. She didn't give up on love because James was controlling. She didn't give up because Robert was safe. She didn't give up because Edward died. She gave up on love because she finally realized she'd been defining it wrong her entire life. 50 years. For 50 years Margaret believed love was something you find. Something that walks through the door in the form of another person and makes you whole. Her mama taught her that. Movies taught her that. Every love song she'd ever heard taught her that. The message was always the same: you are half a person, and somewhere out there is the other half, and your only job is to find them. That's the lie. That's what Margaret gave up on. Not love itself. The fairy tale. The search. The idea that she was incomplete without somebody else's name attached to hers. She gave up on the belief that she was a half waiting to be made whole. And when she let that go, she found something better than anything James or Robert or even Edward had given her. She found peace. Real peace. She found mornings where she didn't need anyone sitting across the table to feel full. She found friendships deeper than any romance she'd ever had. She found the version of herself she'd been abandoning for other people since she was 19 years old. Margaret didn't give up on love. She gave up on the lie that love has to come from someone else. The moment she started pouring into herself what she'd been pouring into other people for 50 years, she finally had enough. Do you agree with her? Or do you think she's wrong? Tell me in the comments because I know this one is going to start a conversation. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you need to hear how Margaret's story ends. Because the way she's living now at 70 will change the way you think about what it means to be whole. Now Margaret wants to be clear about something. She's not telling anyone not to love. She's not saying relationships are bad. Edward proved to her that love between two people can be extraordinary. That kind of love is real and it's beautiful, and she would never take those 2 years back. But she is saying this. Stop waiting for love to save you. Stop staying in relationships that shrink you. Stop settling for good enough because you're terrified of being alone. And stop believing that being alone means being unloved. Those are two very different things. Margaret is 70 years old. She has her garden, her books, her grandchildren, and her mornings. She is full. Not because she found the right person. Because she finally became the right person for herself. She spent 50 years looking for someone to love her the way she needed. Turns out, she was the someone. She was always the someone. If this story changed the way you think about love, even a little, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, what's the hardest lesson love ever taught you?